On behalf of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College Law School, my name is Patricia McCoy, and I'm a faculty member at the law school. Let me welcome you today to our event, which is titled Race and Economic Justice During COVID-19 and Beyond: The Path Forward in Massachusetts. This year has brought racial and economic injustice sharply to the fore. People of color are disproportionately suffering from the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and income insecurity. Meanwhile, the murder of George Floyd highlighted the threat of violence under which so many Black people live. These problems are not new. They are the legacy of centuries of oppression. Over the years, those injustices have been baked into the very structure of our society, and they live on today. To appreciate that here in Boston, consider just this statistic. In 2017, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston reported that the median net worth of Black households in the greater Boston area was $8. Let me repeat that, $8. As a society, we can do better, and we must. To explore these and similar issues, we have a distinguished group of speakers today. Our moderator will be Richard Cordray. We are honored this year to have Mr. Cordray as the Rappaport Distinguished Professor, Visiting Professor at Boston College Law School. He has had a long and storied career in public service as the Attorney General of the great state of Ohio, as Treasurer and the first Solicitor General of that state, and as the first Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in Washington, D.C., appointed by President Obama. Most recently, Mr. Cordray was the Democratic nominee for Governor of Ohio. We are also joined by three distinguished panelists. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. William Mo Cowan was the U.S. Senator for Massachusetts in 2013, where he co-sponsored the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. Today, Senator Cowan serves as the president of Global Government Affairs and Policy and Developed Markets for General Electric Company. His many other professional achievements are legion. They include positions as the former legal counsel and chief of staff to Governor Deval Patrick and as partner at the law firm of Mintz-Levin. We are honored to welcome Senator Cowan here today. Next, Karen E. Spilka is the president of the Massachusetts State Senate. She began her legislative career in 2001 as a state representative for the 7th Middlesex District. Later, in the Senate, she served in a series of important leadership positions, including as Senate Majority Whip and chair of the Senate Committee on Ways and Means. Before entering public service, Senator Spilka had a long career as an attorney, arbitrator, and mediator specializing in labor and employment law. Senator Spilka, welcome to our law school. Finally, we are delighted to welcome back our own Boston College Law School graduate, Tanisha M. Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan is the president of the Boston branch of the NAACP and a leading voice on racial and economic justice. She also serves as Associate General Counsel to Sanofi Genzyme, a biotech company in Cambridge. Previously, she practiced corporate law with large law firms and major corporations in Greater Boston and New York City, focused on corporate finance. Ms. Sullivan has also played a leading role in public education here in Boston, serving as the Chief Equity Officer for Boston Public Schools from 2013 through 2015. Welcome back, Ms. Sullivan. Before we begin, I have two reminders for the audience. First, today's event is being recorded. And second, we will have questions and answers following the panel discussion. Audience members, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we can turn to them following the discussion. And with that, let me turn today's event over to Mr. Cordray. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McCoy, and welcome to everyone who's joined this very timely and very needed program. In terms of the panel discussion, I'm going to start, and each of us in turn is going to speak for something like 5 to 7 minutes. Then we will open up for questions. I'm going to start with a little bit of diagnosis, which frankly is the easy part. Then I'm turning it over to a distinguished set of public policy professionals and political leaders who are going to try to address some of the responses and needs that we have. Certainly the issue of race in America is not a new issue, and the problem of racial disparities and racial injustice in our society has loomed for as long as we have been here on this continent. It also means that racial injustice has seeped into every institution of our society, and we're not going to necessarily have a chance to address all of those today, whether that's the legal system, the political system, the social system, areas of housing, areas of income, you name it. Racial disparities and racial injustice are part of the texture of American society. That is the way it is. It's not the way it should be. It's not the way we want it to be. It's not the way we hope it will be forever. And it is constantly a struggle for us to work on those issues and make improvements. I'm going to start with, as I said, a little bit of diagnosis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the previous financial downturn that occurred in 2008, 2009. And one of the things I want to highlight is every time we have an economic recession or setback in this country, it tends to have a differential impact on different groups in American society. Employment, which is such a backbone of life for Americans, tends to be on the last in, first out principle. So when we have a downturn and people are thrown out of work, those who are newer to the workforce tend to be the first ones who are excluded from it and pushed back out again. That tends to disproportionately affect communities of color and Americans based on race and ethnic origin. It doesn't always, affect Americans based on gender. It certainly affects new Americans who have just come into the workforce. There's seniority principles at work in many workplaces, and there's just the general principle that people prefer the familiar to the unfamiliar. During the economic downturn of 2008, that was an inevitable byproduct, as it always will be, but there was also a special aspect to the financial crisis of 2008, which was that it was driven by bad lending in the mortgage market, and it affected disproportionately the mortgage and housing markets. What did that mean? There was predatory lending that undeniably was targeted at communities of color across this country. And therefore the wave of foreclosures, which reached 4 million or more in the wake of that crisis, disproportionately affected communities of color. What did that mean? It meant that many families and households whose wealth was tied up in their housing values rather than in the stock market or rather than in the bond markets was targeted and under attack and decimated by the results of what happened there. Many housing values cratered, whole communities cratered when they had a significant number of foreclosures. People who were foreclosed on and lost their homes found it difficult to get back into the housing market. If you have a foreclosure on your credit report, you're blocked from credit for 7 years. And the amount of wealth that evaporated in the wake of that particular financial crisis was vast, and it was disproportionate, and it will have a lasting effect for the next several generations. That's the backdrop as we come into the current COVID crisis, which again has been an economic downturn. We had had a strong, I would say medium strong recovery, but a sustained recovery for more than 10 years. in this country. Unemployment had sunk to historically low levels. Many people had been brought into the workforce who were not working before, were unable to find work before. Wages were actually starting to rise on a sustained basis for the last several years, toward the end of the Obama administration and the beginnings of the Trump administration, as this recovery had picked up steam. All of that ground to a halt earlier this year when the economy was abruptly shuttered because of the virus. Unemployment spiked. And again, that inevitable effect of unemployment spiking is to have a disproportionate impact on communities that were last in and then first out of the workforce. And we have seen African-American unemployment and Latino unemployment spike heavier than the total unemployment. That's a differential impact. Notably, we've also had, as you have with any economic crisis, you have particular causes and you have particular effects. And those can themselves be disproportionate, and they have been here. Because what we've seen in this crisis, this downturn, unlike the last one, is a divide between the face-to-face economy, which is more heavily focused on services, and the economy where people can do their work remotely, as we're all doing this session today, where income and employment was affected less. That has been disproportionately affecting communities of color in this country as well, simply because of the makeup of the workforce. Notably, it's had a gender effect as well, as more women are employed in the service economy disproportionately than men. At the same time, also, we've had the normal effects of unemployment, the normal terrible effects of unemployment, which is those who were late to the workforce and just got in are pushed back out. They again do not have income. They are behind on bills. They're behind on rent. They're behind on mortgage payments if they own a home. And that crisis is coming. It was forestalled a bit in the spring by heavy fiscal stimulus from the federal government. Perhaps we will get more. That is not clear at the moment. If we don't, this will finally lead to dramatic and statistically alarming problems in our society, of which we're already seeing many because the effect is differential already in terms of who's gotten relief and who has not gotten relief. But the effects for our society, the effects of economic injustice as reflecting racial injustice in our society are severe. They are insistent. They call for new and I think more effective leadership to navigate the pandemic and also to help put things back together across this country. That's the challenge we face today, and that's the challenge the panel is taking up and has in its sights for this discussion. Now, I assume we'll go in alphabetical order as we did with the introductions. So Senator Cowan, if you'd like to come in at this point.
Thank you, Director Cordray. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the Rappaport Center for Law and Justice and for BC for inviting me to participate in this discussion with this august panel. It's good to be back among many friends I see on here. And I thank all of you for listening in today from wherever you may be. And I hope wherever you are safe and healthy. Look, I think Rich actually provided a significant foundation for what I hope and actually I know will be a robust discussion between Tanisha, the Senate President, and myself and Rich around issues of race and justice. This is a pivotal moment in the history of our nation. We are days away from arguably the most consequential national election of many of our lifetimes. And it is arriving after a summer that was heated in every sense of that word, where we as a nation, as a society, and as a national community were confronted with some harsh realities and truths about who we are, who we have been, but has sparked conversation, dialogue, and debate about who we think we might become or ought to be. And I have spent many of those weeks and a few of those months steeped in conversation with friends and allies and the political community and the business community about what this moment means for all of us, this moment of reckoning, and what we're going to do with the realities in which we find ourselves and the reality we'd like to prepare ourselves for. I would say, as we begin this discussion, candidly, I have a lingering concern coming out of the summer. I think the summer, what happened over the summer was important. And I should say going back into the late winter, early spring. Because we found ourselves, as the director said, dealing with two significant pandemics. The first was the coronavirus and the impact it was having globally, with a common thread and theme, which is to say it was having the most detrimental and disproportional impact on the most vulnerable parts of our society. And here in the US, that continues to be communities of color, the poor, the immigrant community. And then we saw, perhaps most strikingly in the case of the murder of George Floyd, the lingering and historic problem we still have with the disrespect for Black lives and lives of other communities of color, often as impacted in the most ferocious and negative and deadly ways by institutions that are empowered by authorities ostensibly to protect and serve. And that's 400 years of history. But in those two incidents, those two pandemics, we see the common strain that we are still far and away from this perfect union we claim we want to be. And in there, we recognize that there are still people vulnerable in our society and our culture, and those vulnerabilities are perpetuated over time by systems that have been created often on the backs of the most vulnerable citizenry. And the disproportionate realities that we face continue to grow. And we continue to be a nation, unfortunately, that is a series of haves and have-nots, and the gulf there widens daily. And it widens in part because, candidly, many of our institutions, because they have that lingering strain of divisiveness between them, institutional racism, sexism, and otherwise, and those empowered in those institutions have far too often have not grappled with the reality of using the institutional power to change the institutions themselves to ensure equity and justice. And that includes our political institutions, that includes our business institutions, and too many others. And part of the work I've been doing over the last several months, at least in the business context, is talking to friends, allies, foes even, about what the business community needs to be doing in these moments. What is the role of the business community in times of crisis, where we recognized in the instance of these dueling pandemics that we have these significant gulfs and differences and divisions among our citizenry, and what role must we play in trying to bridge the divide, understand our obligation as corporate institutions to the community interest, and grapple with things that may not appear like they go directly to our bottom line, but impact our employees, our communities, and our culture in ways that we have an opportunity and an obligation to shape. That's one of the reasons I was excited about this conversation today, because I'm worried about where we find ourselves today. I'm worried because I wonder, and I still am not yet convinced whether we collectively will have the enthusiasm, the continuing enthusiasm and stamina to continue to grapple with these issues, because there are no easy answers. We're talking about hundreds of years of systemic challenges that we have not tackled deeply, successfully, strategically enough. So there are no overnight solutions. It will take sustained energy and effort from all of our institutional players and individual influences to really drive forward and create sustainable change. The question for all of us on this call is, will we have the stamina to push forward? For me as a corporate leader, will the institutions with which I'm associated have the stamina and show the willingness to continue to do the hard work that will be required for us to move farther along that pathway to being a more perfect union where every man, woman, and child, regardless of race, creed, color, orientation, or otherwise, actually has a chance to experience that elusive notion that we call the American dream, where they're treated fairly, equitably, and not subject to insidious discriminatory practices that still linger often within our most dominant institutions. So that's the question on my mind. That's the question I'm sure we'll engage on today. And as we prepare ourselves for this next national election, just a few days, if not hours away, if you will, the question is, will this election be a catalyst for a continuing conversation about positive change in this nation? Or will we find ourselves falling farther backward and into deeper chasms and divisions that will drive us away from each other and away from our ideals? Thank you, Rich. You're on mute, I think.
Thank you, Senator Cowan. I believe we next get to hear from Senator Spilka. Senator?
Thank you, Director Cordray, and thanks to the Rappaport Center for inviting me here today to speak on this very important discussion. And it's great to see Senator Cowan and always great to see Tanisha. Thanks for being here as well. So like all of you, I'm interested in hearing from the other panelists and have the opportunity to discuss what's happening in our communities with regards to COVID and racial and economic justice. As the prior speakers have already noted, we've been living through really unprecedented public health crisis, and that crisis has laid bare the inequities in our system that have existed long, long before this public health pandemic, especially in healthcare and economic resiliency when it comes to the wealth gap. COVID has ravaged our communities, and the Senate, we have tried to prioritize and address some of the economic inequities that have become made much worse by these two pandemics that Senator Cowan has so eloquently gone through, the healthcare COVID pandemic, but the pandemic of racial, systematic racism that has pervaded our country for hundreds of years. With that, we have in the Senate tried, the word that comes to my mind is intentional. We have tried to intentionally use our power to insert resources and tools in whatever bill we are working on. The first bill that I'd like to address, just to give a smattering of some of the ways the Senate is approaching this, every couple of years, there's an economic development bill that the legislature passed. This year, the Senate passed what we call the Endure Act. It was passed in July and is now in conference committee. It's a sweeping economic recovery and development bill that provides much needed support to businesses, invests in infrastructure, and creates new jobs in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the tools and resources that we have added are things like $35 million in funds to community development corporations, prioritizing those that assist businesses historically facing obstacles to getting capital, including minority-owned businesses and businesses in economically distressed areas. $20 million to low-income small business entrepreneurs, with preference given to businesses located in low or moderate income areas or socially and economically disadvantaged businesses, including businesses owned by people of color. And $27 million for social enterprise organizations whose job is to reduce barriers to employment, especially in communities experiencing social and economic inequities or who have faced racial or ethnic prejudice. We also, in this bill, seek to expand what we refer to as the Massport model by requiring all state authorities to award points in the bidding process for bids with racial and gender diversity for real estate, air rights, long-term leases, design and construction work, giving a greater shot to those groups that have historically been left out of major development projects, again, intentionally trying to share the wealth of these projects. This provision is an excellent example of the way that government can provide the tools and resources, intentionally provide the tools to move us towards greater equity when equity is in fact the goal. So I want to take a moment to recognize that the state Senate, I know, does not reflect the diverse makeup of the Commonwealth, and that there have been times in our Commonwealth's history when equity may not have been the goal of the state legislature, whether it have been by accident or design. But since I've become Senate President 2 years ago, equity and inclusion have been my goals and the goals of the Senate. Equity is in fact the reason that I originally ran for the legislature. Reforming the Chapter 70 education funding formula was the reason I ran for the House almost 20 years ago. It blows my mind. It's been almost 20 years. And along the way, I discovered that there are a lot of inequities, some small, some big, some very big, that I strongly believe that I, as a legislator, need to push our government to address. And that's why one of my greatest points of pride is I ran to reform the education funding laws and the Student Opportunity Act, reforming the education funding laws, for me, almost 20 years in the making. When I originally was on the school committee, was one of the first major pieces of legislation to get signed into law once I became Senate President. The Student Opportunity Act finally, after decades, creates a framework with funding to close those persistent achievement gaps across the state, giving our students both the opportunities and the tools they need to succeed. This bill was rightly called a landmark achievement and celebrated, but I believe that we must look at every bill, both small bills and big bills, through the lens of equity and inclusion, and be intentional about it. I have long argued that when everyone is given both the opportunities and the tools to successfully participate in our economy, we will succeed. We all succeed. As a woman, I'm the proud one of the lead sponsors for pay equity that we passed. We're one of the strongest in the nation now. Paid family and medical leave, I fought hard for, and having more women and diverse genders and races and ethnicity on boards of directors, among other issues. As the sister and legal guardian of a woman with Down syndrome, I successfully fought for self-sufficiency for persons with disabilities because I know how much that weekly paycheck meant to her, and she would let us know its importance. It really was tremendous. We heard the voices of protesters for racial justice this spring and this summer. The Senate passed comprehensive police reform and racial equity legislation. We tried to seize the moment. We worked hard. We came up with what I think is a very good bill. We successfully fought for an economic empowerment and justice reinvestment grant program for communities disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system in the Senate's version of the General Government Bond Bill, which survived conference and is now law. Historically, that kind of fund is not developed in a general government bond bill, but again, we tried to seize the moment. In each instant, government can and must provide tools and funding to bring us closer to the goals of equity and inclusion. This can be achieved, I believe, by addressing systemic issues like the police reform and racial equity bill, as well as more targeted issues. I do believe, like the racial justice and police reform bill I refer to, that was a sprint. We seized the moment, needed to get it done well, but quickly, swiftly. But the other issues, this is a marathon as well. That's why the Endure Act included a provision in targeted issues to remove natural hair braiding from the state licensure regulation. It applied to hairdressing, and it was including the braiding, which prevented the work from being done, the people from actually getting the work done. And it was an unnecessary and unjust barrier to work. So as we continue to navigate the public health crisis of COVID-19 and our long-term economic resiliency, it's more important than ever to hear from folks what other tools are necessary to help people and businesses and communities not only adjust to our new normal, but create newer ways of doing things. We should not go back to our old normal. We should be creating a better, newer normal. And I know that the crisis is hitting certain populations very hard. People of color, those with low wage jobs who were unable to go to college, or working parents, mothers particularly. In fact, working mothers are nearly 3 times more likely to lose their jobs than working fathers, resulting, and this is an amazing statistic, in nearly 2.5 million women dropping out of the labor force nationwide during this pandemic since February. 2.5 million women. And we need these women, and these women need a paycheck. As I said earlier, this crisis had laid bare the inequities of our systems and threatens the gains that we have made in equity. But I believe in Massachusetts and our ability to solve problems together. So I remain committed to working in a collaborative way with people from all backgrounds and expertise, and coming up with solutions and using the power of legislation and policy to right some of the wrongs and continue on this path. So the Senate will continue to roll up its sleeves and do the work of seeing us through this economic recovery with a real sharp focus, a laser focus always on equity and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Spilka. We now are fortunate to have the chance to hear from President Sullivan.
Thank you, Director Cordray, and certainly I want to thank Senator Cowan and Senate President Spilka for really helping to frame out what we will discuss today. I am really excited to be a part of this conversation as a member of the Board of Advisors for the Rappaport Center. This is a conversation that is certainly timely. And I am hopeful that as a result of what we discuss here today, folks will be inspired to hopefully do more and to go deeper in this work. For my opening comments, I do want to really speak to on one hand, the history of the NAACP nationally and locally on issues of racial equality. It is true that for well over 100 years, both nationally and here in the Commonwealth, the NAACP has been on the front lines in the fight for racial justice. And we have a rich, deep legacy of achievement and progress toward greater racial equity and equality. And so today, through the COVID-19 public health pandemic, the economic crisis that has followed it, and of course, the racial reckoning and awakening that has swept our nation, we are truly doubling down, if you will, on the fight for racial justice and equality, whether it is on issues related to healthcare access and eliminating racial disparities that exist there, or in our fight for greater equity in our public education system. We know that in 2020, entering 2020, as the Senate President outlined, we already had a fight on our hands to help ensure that there was education equity in our public schools. The public health pandemic that has been brought to us through by COVID-19 has only served to exacerbate, in many respects, the gaps that exist in public education today, even in the Commonwealth, where we tout one of the best public education systems in the country. And so for us, of course, we know that it is even more important that we continue to pursue public policy solutions in education that will seek to interrupt the learning loss that would otherwise be inevitable through this pandemic. Of course, public safety, as the Senate President outlined, critically important, both at the state level and in our cities and towns, where most of us in the Commonwealth come face to face with public safety. Being intentional about this opportunity to rethink, reimagine, if you will, what public safety looks like in our towns. And of course, economic opportunity, which I'm looking forward to us delving deeper in today. Indeed, meeting this moment will require all of us to be courageous in our leadership, to be innovative in our design and thinking about public policy solutions, and to operate with a sense of urgency and with great intentionality, to really advance, accelerate, I would say, catalyze our movement toward racial equality, and to exceed all expectations as it relates to meeting this moment. So I look forward to contributing to this conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Director Cordray.
All right, before we go to the audience questions, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative here. I want to pose a follow-up to each of the panelists and ask you to see if you could try to respond in about 2 minutes or less. Keep it tight because we do want to get to everybody's questions. But I'll start with Senator Cowan. You talked about something I think was tremendously important, which is the need for stamina and perseverance in this effort. And of course, everyone is fatigued right now by what life has been like under the lockdowns imposed by the virus. And we're fatigued with how abnormal it all seems and feels. But you talked about the business community. What is the role of the business community? How can it help thinking about the effects of unemployment, thinking about the differential effects, as you noted, of the pandemic itself? I mean, it's one thing if you have a team of 9 doctors and you can waggle your finger and get airlifted to Walter Reed Medical Center, but most families are struggling with the fact that they may or may not have access to paid health care. They may or may not have access to regular medical assistance. They have to weigh the cost of going to the doctor when they start to feel any symptoms. These are realities for people, and the business community can try to cushion some of this blow. What is and should the business community be doing right now?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There's a lot that we should and ought to be doing, and hopefully many of us are doing. First, I start with the business. I start with the community part of the question, right? Businesses are part of the community, and they are made up of individuals, men and women who come from the communities, who go home into those communities. The George Floyd situation happened in Minnesota, right? I'm sitting in downtown Boston right now, and folks on this call may be dialing in from anywhere, but in one form or another, I suspect we all, particularly for Black people, internalize what happened there, and you carry that with you, Rob. Rich, every time there's an incident like that, I'll just tell you, this Black person in America feels it, experiences it. I've never lived through a pandemic like coronavirus before, but I've been living for the balance of my life through that other crisis, that other pandemic of institutional racism. It's been there since day one. So I too am fatigued by that, and will continue to be fatigued until we deal with it. And one of the ways we're going to deal with it is all these important institutions, including the business, corporate community, lean in. I think one of the most important things at moments like this is, to use a word that you've heard throughout, is business community needs to be intentional to acknowledge that the things that we are seeing on the news that are impacting our communities mean that they're impacting our people, our workforce, our stakeholders, and others. And you just have to acknowledge that these are not foreign incidents that are happening in the distance, and they're academic experiences. People are internalizing that, bringing them into the office. In incidents like this, I think if you're a leader in a business, you might want to take a moment to just give space and acknowledge the impact on your workforce and let people tell you how they're feeling. I certainly did that in the wake of the George Floyd killing, and frankly, shared my own feelings and vulnerabilities in that moment. At the same time, corporations are important, influential institutions, and we are members of the community. And I think we have a community obligation to just not say, hey, listen, doesn't have anything to do with our bottom line, so let's not concern ourselves with it. That is not our role. Our stakeholders increasingly are demanding more from us. And when I say our stakeholders, yes, I include our shareholders, but I also include our governmental partners. I include NGOs and others who have a vested interest in how we go about our business. And they are demanding that our approach to the citizenry, our citizenship, match the other high standards that we promote. And in moments like this, corporations need to lean in. You need to listen to your workforce, to your shareholders, to see what they're concerned about, and then figure out how you use your considerable resources to be positive contributing actors to change, to the dialogue. And depending on the business, depending on the institution, that may look differently to different people or at different times. Maybe it's making some significant contribution to a cause or an organization that's trying to make some change. Look, maybe you're in a consumer space and it's about how you promote yourself or what organizations you get behind. But whatever it is, it's not to sit on the sidelines. Corporations, business entities have to own not just part of the problem, but own being part of the solution. Use our influence, because corporations are made up of people. There are 200,000 plus people in GE, for example. So when people talk about GE, I think about those 200,000 people and what these incidents mean to them and how they carry that with them.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna intervene. Yeah, go ahead, President Cowan.
I'll use some of my time on what would have been my question, but I do want to build on what Senator Cowan just shared, because I don't want to miss this opportunity to do so. I agree with everything that he shared. And I want to kind of put on the table that oftentimes when businesses think about their role as it relates to bringing about greater racial equality, we talk about, the role of the business community, how can the business community support? I want to submit that it is the responsibility of the business community to actively participate in efforts to address systemic racism. The reason being is that the business community has historically played a role in the development, implementation, and advancement of policies that have been designed to exclude. We can look at policies related to redlining or policies related to mortgage lending, life insurance policies, hiring practices, supplier diversity policies, and the list goes on and on. There have been intentional acts on the part of our, and I include myself in that, business community that have excluded. And so it is incumbent upon the business community to play an active role in the undoing of those policies and therefore replace those policies with ones designed to be intentionally inclusive.
Here.
Okay, thank you for that. And by the way, I think we're kind of gravitating towards some common themes here. If I understood what Senator Cowan said and you just building on it, it's important for leaders, whether in the private or public sector or nonprofit sector, to show the awareness of the problem, to actually consciously let people know that they are understanding and recognizing the problem, because otherwise people suspect that they're missing it, that they're not getting it, that they're not facing it. Then it's important to be doing something, to actually take steps that are intended to respond to the problem. They may or may not be sufficient, they may or may not be the right ones, but take action. And then crucially importantly, I thought what Senator Cowan mentioned, it's important for people to understand that you're doing that. People need to know what corporations are doing to try to respond to racial injustice, because not only will they then have a sense that something is actually happening, but it sets an example for other corporations to follow as well. So visibility around this is quite important. And that goes over to you, Senator Spilka. You talked about, the phrase you used was the intentional use of power, and how the Senate has sought to respond, how the legislature has sought to respond to this moment. My question to you is, that sounded right on the money to me, and some of the different ways you illustrated. What is your confidence, or what do you expect, or what do you want to see out of Washington in terms of the federal government's intentional use of power at this crucial moment in coming months?
I could be here till next week answering that question. Some of it may not be great for those to hear, but boy, you know, I just want to say it was great to hear Senator Cowan and Tanisha talk about the role of the business community and acknowledging the systemic racism and the awareness and the changes that need to be made, and making changes, trying. It may not always work, but I would submit that it's not just business. That is true for every single system in our society, whether it be business, federal government, state government, local governments, you know, nonprofits, any organization, any group of people need to be much more aware of systemic racism, their reaction to it, their, you know, bias involved as well. And we need to talk openly about this, and we have not throughout our history. We've pushed it down. It's then made it easier to not take affirmative action, not be intentional. So I think that, you know, on the level of the federal government, I'm trying to couch my words reasonably, but I'm not a person of color, clearly, but it has been very difficult for me to hear what is happening, see what is happening, the dismantling of programs, of services, of voting. I mean, just every aspect of our life there has been, unfortunately, it appears, an intentional way about dealing with taking away opportunities, taking away rights, and just that has to stop. I mean, there's no way, there's no couching a phrase to make it sugarcoating it. We as a country have to demand that it stops. And that's why, I think we need change from the top. I will leave it at that, in terms of.
Yeah, and obviously we don't want to get overly political here, although it's impossible to separate this from.
It is, it really.
But at a baseline, we want to stop seeing indifference, an attempt to sort of brush this problem aside, to pretend like what everybody is seeing in America is not what the reality is in America. That's a basic. But let me turn to you, President Sullivan, and you started addressing this in your discussion with Senator Cowan, but what would you like to see out of Washington so that you could turn to people in the community, some of whom are despairing that there will be any change or are skeptical, that here is signs of progress, here is hope, here's some confidence you can have that things are going to change. What could Washington be doing that would help you in that respect?
Well, I think, out the gate, when I think about Washington, certainly, many of us are focused on what's happening at 1600, but I look to Congress, quite frankly. And I think one of the things that must happen is really work and better consensus building, more reaching across the aisle. What we have, of course, is a heavily divided along partisan lines, Congress that has led to, in many respects, impotence at the federal level. And that cannot be sustained. It is not good for our country. It is not good for our cities. It's not good for our neighborhoods. And so, and I think we all bear responsibility in that. And so I'm hopeful that as we move into 21, that our Congress, that our congressional leaders figure out a way to actually work on behalf of the American people. That said, I also believe that it's important for us here in the Commonwealth not to always point to Washington and talk about what they should be doing, but to be introspective about what we need to do. We have local control over what happens here in the Commonwealth, what happens here in cities and towns. And so I'm hopeful about what we're seeing at the State House, but at the same time, I'm hopeful that we'll actually get some of these, what I think are really targeted, important policy solutions across the finish line so that we can turn them into some law here in the Commonwealth. I'm also hopeful that when we think about, to Senator Spilka's point, when we think about this issue of racial equality, specifically in the economic sense, this is critically important. We cannot deliver on the promise of this country for freedom, justice, and equality for all if our economic systems are not working for all people. Okay, when we have people who have consistently and repeatedly and with intentionality been left out, we've got to fix this thing so that we can all fully participate. And so with that, I do think it's important for us to really, we talk about being bold. I want to talk about also being fearless. If we acknowledge that we have an issue as it relates to racial equality, as it relates to racism, then our solutions should be intentional about calling out racism, right? And we should not shy away from having solutions that are designed to have an outcome that impacts race, right? That has racial equality at its core. And so I'm hopeful, again, that as we move to 21, whether it's happening at the federal level, state level, or in our cities and towns, that we'll be more fearless and intentional about having race-conscious policy solutions designed to help us all advance.
Excellent. And by the way, I wanted to reflect on what you said earlier about the NAACP's role for now over 100 years. And I wanted to say that as we're fighting this legacy of racial injustice in this country, it's important to recognize that we have made tremendous progress. denying that. We've gone from a system of slavery, followed by a system of enforced peonage, racial segregation throughout the South and North, redlining and the like. We've overcome a lot of those things. But when you're climbing a mountain, you get partway up and you've trudged a long way. Sometimes you pause and look around and realize there's still a long way to go. And it can be a discouraging thing. And we need new inspiration now to keep ourselves back on that trek, to keep climbing the rest of the mountain. And it is a long way to go still. Now, Professor McCoy, I know, was going to be handling audience questions and they want to participate in this discussion. So Pat, if you want to come in with those at this point, that'd be fine.
Which I'd be delighted to. So let me start with this question from one of our Rappaport Center Advisory Board members, Sean Fontes, who is asking about the question of reparations for Black Americans, and that the federal government this year has found close to $3 trillion in relief money since March, but still is unwilling to pay reparations. For the panelists, what are your feelings about reparations as a solution, particularly when there are economic experts stating that to close the racial wealth gap, reparations is the most effective, if not only, solution?
Who'd like to start on that one? It's a tough one. Who wants that one?
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
And Sean, thank you for the question. I'm glad that you're participating in today's conversation. Look, I think that it's important to acknowledge that reparations is not a concept or an idea that we as a country haven't used in the past. It's not new. It has been used as a tool to repair harm. I mean, that's what reparations is about. It's about repairing past harm. And if we acknowledge, Dr. Cordray, to your point, that in this country 400 plus years ago, our economic system was in fact built on forced enslavement of other human beings who have nevertheless continued to live and thrive and contribute to our community, then I do think a consideration of reparations is in order. At the federal level, as we know, for years now, there have been bills advanced to study this concept of reparations. And I know here at the state level, there have also been bills filed to address the same issue. I think, again, this goes back to my comment earlier about being fearless. I think, when people hear reparations, a lot of fear can kind of creep in, and as a result, this can be rejected. This idea can be rejected out of hand. I think that if we are truly committed to addressing and remediating for past harm that absolutely has an impact in our current day, then we must be willing to consider reparations as part of a portfolio of public policy solutions that could address this issue.
I agree. I agree. And I'd only add, I think, and Tanisha just made the last point, we get hung up on this notion of reparations, right? Tanisha makes a very good point. Reparations is a historical economic concept to repair damage done. It's happened all over the world. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We made a feeble attempt here in this country to deal with reparations for Black people at the so-called end of slavery with 40 acres and a mule. We know how that worked out. And that got us nowhere. And so let's not pretend like this isn't something we know about, we've seen done, and we do it often after global conflict. We call it other things, but it's a form of reparations, right? And so we're so afraid here of having this conversation that we don't dig in and grapple and figure out, how do we actually make amends for the original sin of this nation, which continues to haunt us still to this day, right? And I see people say, well, look, are we still racist? Is institutional racism real? How can we be a racist nation if we elected a Black man twice, right? And I say, to your point, Rich, you're absolutely right. We've made tremendous progress, right? None of the Black people on this call are in chains. None of the women on this call are no longer, denied their rights. But let's not pretend that we're anywhere near where we can be, where we should be, where our founding documents claimed we were going to be, right? We got a ways to go, and we can't move forward fast, farther, finally, until we deal with the reality and the lingering harm that continues to dog our nation and people in our nation, right? So don't tell me we shouldn't have a conversation about reparations because it's too divisive. These uncomfortable, difficult conversations are the only conversations that matter, that will move us forward and fast. Look, whether or not 3 billion or whatever the number is the right number, or is a number, or is there a number? I don't know, but let's have a conversation. That's what I long for in our public policy debate, for my former friends down in DC, my former colleagues in the Congress, right? But to Tanisha's point, this is also state and local conversations too. And just on this point, the sustainability issue, whether it's around reparations, look, in order for us to keep this conversation alive, all of us have to want to keep it alive. It's not just an institutional conversation, it's an individual dialogue, debate that we need to keep giving oxygen to until we can give it life and move us forward. Reparations is absolutely part of that conversation. We shouldn't be shy about it, and we should have the challenging conversations around it, because it ain't the first time we've done it. And I guarantee you it won't be the last time we'll do it for someone else. Why not talk about it for Black Americans?
Right. I just want to add, I agree. I think reparations should be a part of the discussion. And I agree with just what was said by the prior two speakers. We need to keep this conversation out there and alive. We need to talk about the hard issues and the past and the history. You can't move forward until you resolve the past. And I think that it's really important that we talk about reparations and what might that look like. It may be a sum of money, it could be other things. What other ways can we repair the past? That's exactly the word, reparations, and make sure that we move forward. But it's not going to happen if we keep putting it behind us and not raising the issues.
I think we could actually benefit enormously from some sort of reconciliation effort here, the way they had in South Africa under Nelson Mandela. And one of the things I would not like to see is the subject of reparations raised as well, let's just pay X amount and be done with it. There is no being done with it. The legacy of this is lasting. It will continue to infect our society. We need to cleanse ourselves of it. We need to continue to be intentional in the moment going forward, as the Senate President said. There's more to this than just reparations, but I agree that should be part of the conversation. How do you try to make it up to communities that, as Professor McCoy mentioned, have no cushion coming into this current economic crisis and downturn? They have no median household wealth on average. That's a very great problem for families, and it's going to stunt their futures. Professor McCoy, is there some other question you want to put to us?
Yeah, yes, indeed. Our next question comes from Josephine McNeil, who is a renowned local leader in affordable housing. And she addresses her question to Senator Spilka. If we are to address equity and inclusion, it must begin with data. The governor has refused to release data on the number of Black people who have died from COVID-19 in Massachusetts. Can the Senate and will the Senate ask that this data be made public?
I can tell you that the Senate, we have really tried to push for as much transparency and data as possible. We can't just look and say this is happening. We need to have the facts, the figures. I think that this is an area that we can definitely pursue and look more into and break it down, not only by race, but geography and ethnicity, maybe. As much in, I honestly think as much data, as much specific data as we have, we should be looking at, not only for right now to try to prevent the spread and prevent it from getting worse in our communities, particularly our communities of color, but this probably won't be the last so-called pandemic that we ever experience. We need to learn from this and move forward to prevent the spread and prevent this from happening in the same way again.
Now, that's a sobering thought, although no doubt correct. Anybody else want to comment on that? Otherwise, I know we have more questions in the queue.
Yeah, I just want to, kind of pull up a little bit. I agree with everything that the Senator, that Senate President Spilka shared. I want to offer that data, disaggregated data along racial and ethnic lines is critically important to any work we want to do in public policy, regardless of the area of focus. To Senator Spilka's point, I mean, if we are going to design solutions, we've got to follow the data. And one of the areas where we locally in the Commonwealth have struggled is with the collection of disaggregated data along race lines. That's both within government as well as in the private sector. And so again, I think this is an important, this is low hanging fruit, but an important step in the fight for racial equality, disaggregated data.
Yeah, Professor McCoy and I both are very familiar with the fact in the consumer finance marketplace, mortgage data has contained this kind of specificity for you. It's been tremendously helpful and insightful. And by the way, whenever you're surprised by the data, what that tells you is that your outlook on what was going on was off in some respects, and the data corrects that. It's incredibly important, and important that we try to make as much data available for people to be surprised and correct their outlooks as we can on a variety of subjects. Professor McCoy, some other question in the queue?
Yes, there definitely is. Let me just mention in passing to the audience that Mr. Cordray was a leader in making the mortgage data, which contains very, very important race data, much more robust. That rule is now under attack, and we're fighting back against it. But let me take my hat off to Mr. Cordray. So our next question is from an audience member who asked, how do we break down racial and economic segregation, which is a result of cities having minority communities and poor in suburbs, largely white and middle class? Legislative structure makes this change very difficult since zoning is local based and the legislature is composed of local representatives. What are the solutions except for fringe-like showing up at the town meeting and casting your vote for zone change?
I think I need to just clarifying the question. Is this speaking to zoning laws? Is that how you would summarize this, Professor?
I think it's asking, can we go more beyond that in the state legislature, perhaps in Washington with Congress, and change the laws so that zoning laws are not reinforcing racial segregation?
Great, thank you.
Look, I think that's a great question. I'll start, and I'll defer to particularly the Senate President. But I think the way Professor McCoy, you at the end of that question, you said, are there other ways other than the fringe efforts through going to town meeting and engaging? And first of all, let me say, respectfully, I don't consider that a fringe element. I think participating in the local governance process, electoral, whether at a town meeting or some other method or means to ensure your voice is heard, to ensure that people know if you see instances of inequity and you as a citizen, as a resident, think those need to be addressed. I got to tell you, showing up and raising it and talking about it is the most important thing you can do. Let me be clear about that, right? And not enough of us go to town meetings. Not enough of us go to the Board of Select meetings or whatever the governance body is to talk about these issues. If we want change, that is where and how change will come about. It is hard work, it's a slog, and it takes dedication and commitment. It's part of that stamina, that sustainability we talk about. And then you got to take it to, yes, to the State House and beyond. But first thing to do is imagine, talk to your friends and neighbors. You're probably not the only one who's sensing this, feeling this, concerned about this. So build a constituency, build coalitions, right? Engaging in the political process, as much as people hate politics, but engaging in the political process is about taking ownership of the things that control our lives and how we live, where we live, and our values. And I absolutely endorse going to town meeting. And I think, look, there are great, grave, and unfortunate and unnecessary distinctions about lifestyles and opportunities between our urban centers, if you will, and our suburbs. And we should dig in on that. And there are a lot of people undoubtedly on this call associated with the Rappaport Center who are doing so. But we should think about, why do people make the choices they make if they have the choices they can make, right? What is it about our systems, our rules, our regulations, our laws that create this division, or at least don't create enough opportunity that the division wanes over time? What is it about the way we fund our schools? I know this is a topic that the Senate President knows greatly, under Chapter 70 or otherwise, that how do we think about, how do we create environments, communities, neighborhoods where everyone feels like they have a fair shot, that they have safe communities, great schools, where they don't have to run away from some place to run to another place because they feel like that's the only place that's good for them or their family. That's government has a role to play there, but I'll go back to the opening comments I made. There's a role for all of us, business community as well, to think about, how do we positively contribute to that, break down those barriers, break down those silos, and stop thinking about this as somebody else's problem to solve. This is our
I think
problem.
Senator Spilka is trying to get in here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, sorry.
No, it's okay. I was very interested in hearing you speak, and I fully relate to that as an answer. And I wholeheartedly agree. We each have a responsibility to ourselves, our families, to each other. When I moved to Massachusetts, I was surprised. The way the structure of the state is, some states have much stronger county forms of government. The statewide legislation is stronger. Massachusetts is a very strong New England state with 351 municipalities that are very independent in a lot of ways and have a lot of authority to do what they want. Some of it is zoning. For some laws, we do make changes, and we actually have some changes in conference committee right now, which would allow the creation of more affordable housing across the Commonwealth, I believe, in all communities. But what Senator Cowan was talking about was my exact experience. I never planned on being a senator, let alone Senate president. I never planned on being a legislator. There was something going on in my school in my hometown. I was upset by it. I organized with other parents. We mobilized. We went to the school committee, talked to them, and really pushed for some changes. And then I decided to run for school committee. I thought, let me put my money where my mouth is. I was going to either move out of town because I was so angry, or let me run. And I ran for school committee, which prompted me to start running and making changes to the education funding formula. And it was very empowering to realize, wow, I could really help make a change. And we all have that within us. We don't always realize it. And sometimes you don't know where to start. By contacting your local government, find something that you want to get involved in. If it's housing and zoning, talk to some of the folks, there, or organizations where you can help make a change. But it is a process. As I mentioned earlier, it took me almost 20 years to make the changes to the education funding formula that I originally started out doing almost 20 years ago. So it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's, a marathon, looking at that second half going up the hill, taking a deep breath and a pause and just keep going.
Yeah, and again, I would say about zoning and housing policy, the first thing, of course, is to try to keep the government from making things worse. Let's remember that the term redlining came from red lines drawn on maps, often by government officials, by private lenders. And this is how far we've come. The NAACP and others fought restrictive covenants that were sanctioned or even encouraged in mortgages. And we've moved some huge boulders off the path forward. There are other boulders that lie ahead of us. One of the really heartening things about this year is to see that some of the real change and impetus for change is not coming from Joe Biden or Donald Trump. It's coming from people like George Floyd and his family and friends and people in his community, Breonna Taylor, her family, friends, people in her community. Their voices can sing loudly to us, and the events can sing loudly to us. And motivate us to recognize that we have a role to play in again, as Senator Cowan so well put it, borrowing from the Constitution to make a more perfect union, which we have not done, but we've made a lot of progress and we have more to go. President Sullivan, did you want in on this? I thought you might have.
No, I concur with all that has been stated.
Okay.
So we have in our audience the mayor of Lawrence, Massachusetts, Mayor Dan Rivera. Mayor, I really am excited that you've joined us. It's a true honor. His question is this: given that urban school districts were already behind with educating their students, do you think that in order to get them caught up after COVID-19 and we get the all clear to go back to school in person, that we can have a 365-day school year for a few years, cost what it may?
So good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. It's always great to be in your company, and of course, as we have come to expect, putting, I think, an important question on the table. One of the issues that I think we have not paid enough attention to during this pandemic is public education. And I believe that we are in severe danger of potentially adversely impacting a generation if we do not have significant intervention. And if we do not get creative in how we are going to ensure access to quality public education for our young people. And we know that in urban districts like yours in Lawrence, and mine here in Boston, and Springfield and Holyoke, New Bedford and other gateway cities, the children who will be most adversely impacted are Black, Brown, and low income. And so your suggestion of year-round school is one that I do think we should explore. We have to remember that, the structure of a public education system, and I'll hand it over to the former educator here, Senator Spilka, to speak more on this. But, the current calendar is one that was in place when we, had a system, a society that was built on agriculture. Right. And we've shifted away from that. And so I do think that that we should not be bound by this old structure, but to be thoughtful about what it could look like to have year-round schooling and learning opportunities for our children. Again, recognizing that so many of them are at risk, high risk of significant learning loss as we emerge from this pandemic.
Yeah, I would just echo what Tanisha just said, but also I'm certainly open to all ideas. Even being prior chair of Ways and Means, I do not think that money should necessarily rule what we believe is the best thing for our kids and our students, particularly in areas like your city in Lawrence. And thank you for being here, actually, by the way. It's really nice. I can't see you, but I can feel you. But I think that we need to be open to all possibilities. That may be one suggestion. There could be lengthening the school day. There could be so many other ideas. I am not an educator expert, but I want to hear, because we will need to do more for so many of our students. We worked so hard with the Student Opportunity Act and the funding and the way that we structured it to try to, as I said earlier, finally get rid of that achievement gap. I really don't want this pandemic to make that worse, to go in the opposite direction for so many of our students. So I think that we need to really pay close attention, speak with our educators, maybe more professional development for them as well, for our students. What are the real needs? How can we address their needs, and be open to all possibilities and all solutions?
Rich, just on this point real quick. First of all, as a parent, Mr. Mayor, always good to hear from you. As a parent, I'm all for having them in school all year round. So thank you for raising that issue. Maybe give them maybe a couple of weeks off perhaps. But I would say this, it's often attributed to Rahm Emanuel coming out of the financial crisis in 08 and 09, the quote, never waste a good crisis. And you hate to think of the pandemic and that shallow turns. But the reality is, as we work our way out of this pandemic and the impact, we should also look about, it is an opportunity for us to rethink the way we have done things, moving away from the agrarian school schedule, just as we have seen the explosion in a positive way of telehealth in the wake of this pandemic. And I think we should be looking differently strategically about how we go about our education system and otherwise. And this is another place, respectfully, I would say, for public officials and educators to enlist, dare I say, challenge the business community who's well-resourced to help think about the solutions in this moment, because we are the ultimate beneficiaries, if you will, of the education system after all, right? A well-educated society and workforce is what fuels our engine. And the US education system, frankly, is falling behind globally just because we are stuck in our own self-imposed time warp for no good reason.
Yeah, I would simply add, it's a very interesting idea, because if you think that children have fallen behind and they've fallen behind at a differential rate, which I think is undeniable, then if you're going to do something about it, if you're not just going to accept that, you need to do something quickly. And it probably needs to be done within the next school year, or that will start to become a lasting legacy of this crisis. I would point to another thing, which is we've all known for years that there remains a significant digital divide in our society, and that has been sharply exposed again by the crisis that we're facing right now. We need to get serious about fixing that for once and for all. Everybody needs access to the internet. That's almost a basic utility in modern life. And particularly for education. And that's going to be true even when kids are back in school and we're through this crisis. The ability to be able to access the internet on a more equal basis during the nights and the weekends when research is being done and people are looking for answers, that's really critical. And we have done, frankly, a poor job at solving that problem.
Rich, I think as our final question, we've had a really interesting conversation in the chat. I'm going to weave together several strands, keying off a comment by our former Justice Geraldine Hines of the Supreme Judicial Court here in Massachusetts. The question is this: do we have the stamina and the commitment to stay the course? And I will add to that, which is, what can the white community be doing to step up?
So, look, we don't have a choice but to have the stamina to see this thing through. And I think, as I think about where we are today, I am encouraged by, quite frankly, the resilience of the Black community in America. That literally has for 400 plus years been on this journey toward freedom, justice, and equality, and has consistently, made strides to advance those principles, and has consistently sought not only advancement for us as a community, but for all people. As we have fought this fight, doors have flung open for so many others, whether it is expanding rights and access for women, expanding rights and access for our immigrant community, expanding rights and access for our LGBTQ community. I think that the resilience, the fortitude, the determination of the Black community in America is an example. And if we are going to truly win this fight and close these inequality gaps, I do believe that it will be important to not only follow the lead, but also listen to the experiences and listen to the solutions, and listen to the hope and the vision that is bubbling out of the Black community today. And so I am encouraged in this moment, I must say, by so many people of various backgrounds, including my friends and neighbors in the white community, who are, in this moment saying, we want in. We want in, and we want to be in this fight, and are in many respects recommitting to stay in it for as long as it takes. So I do believe that we can, but I also think we don't have a choice.
Period, exclamation point.
I mean, obviously, one of the most important things we all can do is make sure, if we haven't yet, that we cast our ballots between now and Tuesday, because, of course, in our nation, we speak collectively and loudly on these occasions every 2 or 4 years, and it matters to the direction of leadership in the country. So that's obviously necessary. But one lesson we have been reminded of, it's not a lesson we learned because we've known it off and on for a long time in our society, is we didn't have any elections to speak of over the course of the spring and summer. And yet we saw a lot of change in this country because people always have the ability, whether it's an election time or not, to speak up and raise their voices. They have the right to do that. They have the responsibility to do that. And they can see, sometimes it doesn't break through, but it can really matter. It can matter the direction of our society. And that's what's pushing change here, is people raising their voices and speaking out and making it clear that this is not just an issue that's perceived in the African-American community or communities of color. It's an issue that's perceived across this country. Many people have joined that movement, and I think that's been one of the encouraging signs. But I think everybody's waiting with some skepticism and some bated breath to know that there's going to be real lasting change come out of this. And it's incumbent on all of us to ensure and put the pressure on to make sure that it does.
And I just want to add from a political perspective on the state level, as a white woman who hasn't experienced the 400 years plus of racism, I think it's really important that all folks accept one another in this fight. But I think, and I don't have a whole lot more to say than what you said so eloquently, Tanisha. But I think that we need to listen to people of color and let them lead the way, let them voice what is best, whether it be for economic justice or environmental or any housing and education, any of the issues, and be receptive and open to the ideas and creative in ways to remedy and remediate the wrongs that have happened for decades and centuries. But again, going back to this is going to be a long haul. We can't just stop, or we can't just get tired and say, okay, we'll pick this up again. It's got to be intentional and consistent.
Senator Cowan, would you like to have the last word in closing our event today?
Well, Professor McCoy, you clearly do not know me to give me the last word, but the I will just say, listen, it's been a privilege and an honor to be part of this discussion, and thank you all for joining. And I would just say, let's keep the discussion alive. I appreciate the Senate President's last comments about giving space to the communities of color who've been experiencing this, both to give a chance to acknowledge that reality, but also to listen and learn how we can all be our best allies for each other in a fight that impacts all of us, even if it impacts some of us perhaps in even more critical ways than others. And I have, like Tanisha spoke to, I've been so pleased that over the last several months, so many of my friends, neighbors, allies, colleagues who are not Black, who are white, have been willing to say, listen, I want to be part of the solution. I may not even fully understand the problem. And as my former boss and friend and mentor, Deval Patrick, likes to say, those who are woke still need to give space for those who are awakening. And that is critical as we move along this continuum, because we need to do that, because I actually still very much, right? I've never lost faith in the concept of America and what we stand for, right? But I am longing for us to actually be and become that which we hold ourselves out to be. And for us to get there, these are the kind of issues we together must grapple with and commit ourselves to improve upon, so that all of us, whether new to this nation or otherwise, whether Black, white, or otherwise, whether gay, straight, man or woman, we all feel like that opportunity that is embedded in our founding documents is truly available to all of us in an equitable fashion. That is when we will be at our best. That is the American ideal. So thanks for having me today.
Thank you. Senator Cowan and the rest of our distinguished panelists and moderator, I really appreciate the call to action. It certainly has inspired me. Our event is at an end, so let us say thank you to our panelists and to Mr. Cordray for their generous time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Make sure you vote.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.